In the end, what makes Milton a great poet is his surprise, his poetry, not his ideology, not his theology, not his politics. People who think that Milton is made great by any of those things is mistaken. Of course, all of those other things are mediated through his poetry, and in that sense, Milton helps those of us who live very much in the 21st century to recalibrate our understanding of poetry to include things that don't only have to deal with the personal or the emotional or the psychological. Of course, I know there's other genres of poetry that do other things in our age as well, but for Milton, poetry performed many, many functions. As we said before, there is, and where we might think of the distinction between an aesthetic realm, a theological realm, and the political realm, for Milton, all of these things were mutually informing and overlapping. I remember discussing with my great teacher, David Castan, who is still teaching Milton at Yale, that we were discussing, or I was asking him, what is the driver for all of Milton's works? Which one of those sets of commitments, theological, aesthetic, or political, drive them? And at that time, many, many people would have said the political, because that was the flavor of the month back then. But it's clearly, as David said to me back then, theological. So here, let's concentrate carefully just on one set of images. This is in book one, right after Satan is reassuring Beelzebub that their fate is not to lie in infamy and not to lie and not to going to be defined by performing the works of the divine even against their will. Thus Satan, talking to his nearest mate with head uplift above the wave and eyes that sparkling blazed. Wow, right? So when you read 18th century critics of Paradise Lost who are confronting the poem in a way for the first time, I'm thinking of Joseph Addison's Spectator essays, and why I say for the first time is they've cleared away a space in which they can read Paradise Lost not merely as a political document, or not merely as a work by the same person who helped kill Charles I. Addison writes 18 essays about Paradise Lost in his Spectator. It was like the Daily News, but for smart people. And in each one of them, he considers a book of Paradise Lost and six additional essays. And here, I'm pretty sure he stops here. That's sparkling blazed. We have the sense of the heroic Satan. His other parts beside, prone on the flood, extended long and large, lay floating many a rood, in bulk as huge as whom the fables name of monstrous size, Titanian or earthborn that ward on Jove, Briareus or Typhon, whom the den by ancient Tarsus held, or that sea beast, Leviathan, which God of all his works created hugest, that swim the ocean stream. So the first thing to account for is in our line 194, the split between what comes before and after the comma. It's almost as if Milton is giving his readers two sets of lenses. First is this heroic lens, that sparkling blaze, and then from after the comma, his other parts besides, prone on the flood. He is transformed from this heroic classical figure, and we'll see more of that classical Satan at the end of book one of Paradise Lost. And now he's being turned into a monster of myth. Titanian, Typhon, look them up. Leviathan, of course, comes from the Old Testament. Now, after the comma, he has been transformed again from this romantic figure to this monstrous figure. His bulk is huge, as whom the fables name of monstrous size. So at the same time that Milton rejects fables by calling them such, rejecting them by calling them such, he nonetheless invokes them. That is, Milton uses these as a kind of metaphoric lens for understanding something that otherwise we would not be able to understand. As whom the fables name of monstrous size, and then he puts those fables to use. Titanian or earthborn that ward on Jove, Briareus or Typhon, whom the den by ancient Tarsus held, or that sea beast Leviathan, which God of all his works created hugest, that swim the ocean stream. It's interesting how Milton, in this list of fables, or that sea beast Leviathan, which God of all his works created hugest that swim, the ocean stream. Is Milton equating God with the Leviathan, the creation of God, with the creations of the fables? On the one hand, yes, obviously. We'd have to, and on the other, the answer is yes. And Milton is saying these are all lenses, all of them, through which to see Satan, which God of all his works created hugest that swim the ocean stream. Him, this is, I think, a German sentence construction. We don't get, that is the object, the direct object comes first. Him, happily slumbering on the Norway foam, the pilot of some small night-foundered skiff. Him happily slumbering on the Norway foam. We've now changed our horizon, and we're given this image of someone, him happily slumbering on the Norway foam. Who is that him? Oh, here he is. The pilot of some small night-foundered skiff. I wish some of my colleagues who know how to read poetry or scan poetry or explain how poetry works were here. The pilot of some small night-foundered skiff. And we're traveling on the skiff with the pilot of some small night-foundered skiff deeming some island. Oft, there's the pause, as seamen tell. Whoa, one more time. Him, happily slumbering on the Norway foam, the pilot of some small night-foundered skiff deeming some island. Oft, as seamen tell, with fixed anchor and his scaly rind moors by his side under the lee while night invests the sea, and wished morn delays. I have to admit that I'm thrown off by the as seamen tell, but let's continue with maybe that in the back of our minds. There's this pilot, and he sees an island, and that island for him represents a certain kind of salvation. He's going to be saved. He's going to get out of this dark night. With fixed anchor in his. Now that, the antecedent for that is going way, way, way back up to the figure represented in these monsters and in Leviathan. With fixed anchor in his scaly rind moors by his side under the lee while night invests the sea and wished morn delays. So stretched out, huge in length, the archfiend lay, chained on the burning lake. It might have been more prudent to stop so stretched out, huge in length, the archfiend lay. So this image of the pilot provides a microcosm, the relationship between man and the forces of evil that surround him. In some ways, Satan is himself a metaphor for the forces of evil that surround man. Or he is the embodiment in I guess, allegorical terms. He is the embodiment, his character is the embodiment of evil. And here evil is dramatized in a way which is threatening for more than one reason. Not only do we see his monstrous size, but the pilot, who is of some small night-foundered skiff, he feels safety. Why does he feel safety? The pilot of some small night-foundered skiff deeming some island oft as seamen tell with fixed anchor in his scaly ride, moors by his side under the lee, while night invests the sea and wished morn delays. So through this image, the pilot represents a certain kind of human frailty, vulnerability, a vulnerability and frailty about which he does not even know. He throws his anchor into the sea, and when it it meets something solid. He feels safe with fixed anchor in his scaly rind moors by his seat under the lee. But he's invested all of his safety by anchoring in the flesh of Satan. So stretched out huge in the length, the archfiend lay chained on the burning lake. So the sense of the frailty of man. I guess this goes back to the question of the nature of theodicy and why Milton writes a theodicy which succeeds. And we said yesterday, it succeeds insofar that it does not erase evil. And here, in time, this pilot on this night-foundered skiff, in time, there's the fear that he fears because he's alive and vulnerable to the forces of nature, alone on the sea. But even more so, he is not afraid, but should be fearful of forces about which he does not even know. In a sense, Milton is, who is the pilot? Every man. We are all the pilot, fearful of things we know are coming and fearful of things, and fearful perhaps or anxious of things about which we don't even know. And Milton never erases that experience, that sense of, even at the end of Paradise Lost, that sense of uncertainty, of unknowing, of not being sure, of being uncertain of the future. Meaning at the very same time that Milton wants his readers to have a conversion experience. The conversion experience that Milton wants his readers to have is one about time, to go from a conception of time, tomorrow, 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 to the conception of time in tick-tock. But here Milton demonstrates, in this single image, Milton demonstrates the difficulty of maintaining that sense of the future, because you just don't know. The pilot doesn't know. And what he is most afraid of is just the least of it. But Milton is not satisfied with just that image, or he frames that image. So stretched out huge in length, the archfiend lay chained on the burning lake, nor ever thence had risen or heaved his head, but that the will and high permission of all ruling heaven left him at large to his own dark designs, that with reiterated crimes he made heap on himself damnation while he sought evil to others, and enraged might see how all his malice served but to bring forth infinite goodness, grace, and mercy shown on man by him seduced, but on himself treble confusion, wrath, and vengeance poured. Forthright, upright, forthwith upright he rears from off the pool his mighty stature. On each hand the flames driven backward slope their pointing spires, and rolled in billows leave in the midst a horrid veil. Then with expanded wings he steers his flight aloft, incumbent on the dusky air, that felt unusual weight, till on dry land he lights, as if it were land that ever burned with solid as the lake with liquid fire, and such appeared in hue as when the force of subterranean wind transports a hill torn from Pelorus, or the shattered side of thundering Etna, whose combustible and fueled entrails dense, conceiving fire, sublimed with mineral fury, aid the winds and leave a singed bottom all involved with stench and smoke. Such resting found the soul of unblessed feet. I got carried away there. I wanted just to read to the end of the sentence, and it seemed to be a long one. So Milton is not satisfied simply with the representation of the pilot in his vulnerability, but the frame itself becomes reframed. So stretched out huge in length, the archfiend lay chained on the burning lake. So he's transformed in 209 to the archfiend, meaning we're naming him now from a different perspective. He's no longer one of these monstrous figures. He is the archfiend. And not only that, he's chained on the burning lake. In a way, as I said before, we're moving from one narrative to the other. One narrative is the narrative of being in time. The other narrative is the narrative that we know already to be true and it's true from the perspective of outside of time. In some sense, and I think this has to be emphasized, is for Milton, this story that he's telling, this one that's being picked up here with the imposition of the word, or with the word archfiend and then chained, in some sense, it is never fully available to the human. Surely Milton represents it here because he feels driven. He has a mission to write. He has a mission to teach. That's what Paradise Lost is driven by, his mission to teach. Otherwise, Milton, if he didn't have the mission to teach, he would have been too skeptical of the misleading potential of language to write. But he understood that in order to teach, he had to write, notwithstanding the possible risks that are entailed. I guess that's true of all kinds of pedagogy. There's always a risk. I mean, many kinds of risks. Here, Milton is focusing here, and here's the risk of misrepresentation. And Milton is constantly playing with that, which makes sense a little bit over here as well. Who is Satan? What is Satan? And the answer Milton would ultimately say, if you met him alone in a dark wood late at night, someplace in 17th century London, he would say, I think, I don't know. But the I don't know is followed by, I must teach, I must write, I must use poetry in order to write. In order to teach, I need to use metaphors, even though they may not be, get ready for the word, accurate. In fact, Milton probably did not have the word accurate, certainly not early in his career as we do now. It would not have been a criteria for him. And one of the reasons Milton is multiplying images, not just one. Milton's favorite word, as one of my Milton teachers told me in the past, is or, because he's constantly switching perspectives. And he's doing that because he recognizes the problematic nature of representation. So you might say, well, if he recognizes the problematic nature of representation, then why go, pardon the expression, why would he go overboard here? Why does he give us more than one metaphor? Why risk it once, twice, three times? How does that make sense? And I think an approach to Milton would be is that language is always insufficient, and the building up of, or the adding of metaphoric lenses allows readers to understand two things at the same time. The problematic nature of representation, because one representation will never do, and also the extent to which representations in their multiplicity are the only way that we have access to the world. So Satan really is a figure, a character that represents evil, and Milton is giving language to that story. Milton is giving language to a story which is really beyond narrative, it's beyond man. I am suggesting, and this is the weird thing about Milton, is that he is the ultimate epistemological, he has a great deal of epistemological humility. What do I mean by that? He knows the limits of knowledge. He understands the limits of knowledge. He understands the limits of language. And yet he chooses to write. He chooses to use metaphors and poetry in order to get at things that Milton says later in book 3 that may not be lawful to reveal. There is that anxiety in Milton, right? And Milton's anxiety is, and here I don't think it's completely improper to invoke the figure of Maimonides, who Milton did not read, but the Maimonidean perspective that any predicate of the divine will necessarily be not only imperfect, but you cannot, Maimonides will say you cannot predicate the divine. Once you predicate the divine, even if you say God is, even if you say that, you're misrepresenting the divine, because God's being is different than our being. Now, what would Maimonides have thought of Paradise Lost? He'd have several objections to it. But just in terms of the aesthetic, let's forget that. But I'm thinking maybe, how does that Maimonidean perspective help understanding Milton? And I think that the iconoclasm that's built into Maimonidean thought, the distrust of images that's built into Maimonidean thought, is built into Milton as well. And he feels the ultimate skepticism about images, which include language. And yet, he uses language, and the reason he is multiplying images all the time is so they, I think in a way, so they qualify and not negate each other entirely, but show, by showing this and then that, I show that neither one is absolutely true. They're all the metaphors that Milton uses combine in a way to create a worldview, and not only a worldview, an idea about aesthetics and language, that language can do some things, but if you think it can do more than it can do, well, then you're going to be turning into an idolater. I think this might be another way in which Miltonic method is very much like the Midrash. That Midrash also, in its multiplying of perspectives, people always, dumb people will ask me, you ask a question from one Midrash to another, meaning this Midrash says the tribe of Judah were the first to jump into the Sea of Reeds. This Midrash says the tribe of Benjamin were the first to jump into the Sea of Reeds. People who try to answer that question have been in yeshiva too long, right? Meaning you don't have to answer questions like, you don't answer questions like that. They are distinct and different perspectives, and each one is right and each one is insufficient. So that's how Milton is rolling here, basically. And I'm suggesting that it's not only the figure of Satan, but it's this divine narrative which we may think of as bumpity, 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 bump, or tick-tock, and understand it in its gross theological simplifications, and I'm using theological in a bad sense there, or maybe the gross simplification of contemporary theologians. You choose your tradition. It seems to be rampant in all of them, in which history or the divine providence is delivered to man in a package with very neat little bows. In some sense, Milton is giving us that package. In length, the archfiend lay chained on the burning lake, nor ever thence had risen or heaved his head, but that the will and high permission of all ruling heaven left him at large to his own dark designs. Milton is playing with the problem here. Is Satan an independent agent? So he's saying yes, left him at large to his own dark designs, that with reiterated crimes he might heap on himself damnation while he sought evil to others, and enraged might see how all his malice served to bring forth infinite goodness, grace, and mercy shown on man, by him seduced, but on himself, trouble, confusion, wrath, and vengeance poured. So there we do get, there is the talk of the Christian narrative, meaning Satan says, it's kind of like a primitive game of chess. God says, I'm going to do all good. Satan comes on the scene and says, I know that about God. And I know even when I do evil, Satan says this, even when I do evil, God is going to turn it into good, and I'm going to turn it back into evil. And here, the narrative, the providential narrative gets restated. And the providential narrative is the one in which all other narratives are situated. Every other narrative is part of that narrative. So it can be that Adam and Eve are authors to themselves, and God is the author of all things. God is the author of all things. That is that narrative. That's the narrative. That is the choice for Milton of faith. Believing in that conception of time is the choice of faith. Here's what it looks like, and it has obviously very Christian valence here. Here's what it looks like in the doctrinal terms of Christianity. Infinite goodness, grace, and mercy shown on man by him seduced, but on himself trouble, confusion, wrath, and vengeance poured. So I guess the radical thing that I'm suggesting here, or seems radical to me because I've never said it this way before, is that just as Milton, in representing the figure of evil, Satan, has to rely upon metaphors, also, when Milton represents divine providence, he is relying upon metaphors. And for Milton, the privileged metaphor is the Christian one. And even though it's privileged, and notwithstanding that, even that story is only a story which can only represent the truth of the thing that can never be represented fully can only represent it just so well. Milton, again, just go back, two things. The extreme humility about representation, the extreme anxiety, which we'll see later in the poem as well, when Milton imagines himself being maybe torn apart by the muses for failing to do his job properly. So there's that anxiety about representation, about how, as Locke will say later on, metaphors can mislead through their similitudes. But there's also the courage to teach. And Milton, when Milton is read as being of the devil's party without knowing it, we erase the thing that was most important to Milton, and that was his courageous mission to teach, despite the risks. The courageous mission to write poetry, to try to approximate feelings, thoughts, ideas that are not available in ordinary language, that are not available in scientific language. There is more to heaven and earth, my dear Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. So Milton has the courage to write. It's eventually interesting in Hamlet. Horatio is the one who tells the story. And he's also afraid he's not going to tell the story properly. We've got to reread Hamlet, right? That is definitely on our agenda soon, right? And then the second thing we started with, and we went to places, Milton took us places we didn't expect, yay. The way in which Milton is situating the frailty and vulnerability of the human in relationship to the divine. And even when we see that story told in which Satan's evil is subordinated to the divine narrative, divine providence, nonetheless, we still feel that vulnerability. We still feel that frailty. We still feel the powers of evil. See you later. That was fun.